It was on a frost-bitten morning in February, the streets of Mayfair still glittering with a thin crust of snow. The tragedy interrupted the tailored elegance of London's elite. From the windows of Gaspard et Fils, the city's most exclusive bespoke tailor, mannequins stood clothed in fine tweed and brushed wool, silent sentinels of refinement. Inside, however, refinement had given way to horror. The body of Lord Adrian Chatterton, Viscount of Norbridge and heir to a shipping fortune, lay slumped across the fitting dais. A pair of golden tailor's shears, wickedly sharp and glinting like a duelist's blade, protruded from his chest, precisely embedded between the third and fourth ribs. The symmetry would have impressed a surgeon or a tailor. The establishment's owner, Gaspard Lemaitre, a French expatriate whose scissors had once cut for princes and presidents, sat in a state of collapse near the fireplace, face ghostly pale beneath his waxed moustache. "Mon Dieu," he kept whispering. "C'est impossible. I had just stepped out. Just for un petit café." The police had already arrived, led by the competent but unimaginative Inspector Colin Radnor. Though not wholly without intelligence, Radnor had a tendency to leap toward the simplest solution with the eagerness of a man late to supper. Already, his eyes were on the young apprentice tailor, Daniel Northcote, whose shirt cuffs bore small reddish smudges, and who appeared more nervous than a man should if he had nothing to hide. "It's open and shut," muttered Radnor. "The lad had a grievance. We'll find it. There's always a girl or a gambling debt behind it." But as fate, or perhaps design, would have it, a certain Belgian gentleman was already nearby. Hercule Poirot, resplendent in his dove-grey suit and lavender gloves, had just concluded breakfast at Claridge's and was now en route to visit an acquaintance in Mount Street. Drawn by the flashing police lantern and the uneasy ripple that scandals through high society, Poirot paused, his eye catching on the elegant lettering above the tailor's door. "Ah," he said softly, "Gaspard et Fils. I have always said a good tailor is the last honest man in London." By the time Radnor saw Poirot approaching, it was too late. The detective had entered, bringing with him an air of fastidious calm that seemed to rebuke the disarray. "Ah, Inspector Radnor," Poirot greeted him with polite precision. "A murder, yes? And not just any murder, but one committed with, how do you say, a tailor's touch?" Radnor gave him a gruff nod. "Always a pleasure, Monsieur Poirot, but I'm afraid this one is quite straightforward. Man stabbed with shears in a room of shears. Only 5 people had access this morning, and one of them was found covered in blood." Poirot's eyes did not blink. "Ah, mon ami, how comforting it must be to live in a world so direct. But I suspect the truth, as always, will prove to be more tailored." The suspects gathered quickly. 1. Daniel Northcote, the apprentice tailor, 19, fresh-faced but clearly terrified. He had been alone in the back storeroom moments before the body was discovered. Gaspard vouched for his character, but only vaguely. 2. Gaspard Lemaitre, owner of the establishment, once the toast of Paris, now somewhat reclusive. He claimed to have stepped out for coffee during the time of death. No one had seen him leave or return. 3. Lady Eugenia Chatterton, the victim's wife, statuesque and severe. She arrived shortly after the discovery of the body, claiming she had come to pick up her husband's wedding anniversary suit. But her expression betrayed no grief, only cold calculation. 4. Maxwell Venn, a rival tailor and former partner of Gaspard, who had an appointment in the adjoining fitting room that morning. A bitter man with a ruined reputation and a sharp tongue. 5. Beatrice Langdon, Lord Adrian's personal assistant, who had arranged his appointment and insisted it be private. Her loyalty to her employer had always been unquestioned, until now. Poirot took in their faces one by one, his eyes like twin needles threading through fabric. "Please," he said, gently but firmly. "None of you must leave. A man has died, and he was known to all of you. We shall discover who took his life, but for that, it will require not the forensic but the psychological. The manner in which you lie, mes amis, is far more telling than the blood upon your sleeves." He turned to Radnor. "Let us begin, Inspector, by understanding not how the crime was done, but why." Radnor frowned. "But surely we start with fingerprints, statements, the sequence of events?" Poirot raised a manicured finger. "Non, non, that is the English way. But I am Hercule Poirot. I begin where the heart beats, the motives, the minds, the small betrayals one sows into the lining of one's life." He turned to the body of Lord Adrian Chatterton and leaned forward with a surgeon's delicacy. "One does not place Tailor's shears so precisely into the chest unless one wishes to send a message. But what message? That is the question." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft, silent, deceptive. Inside, the air thickened with suspicion. Poirot straightened his lapels, took a slow breath, and prepared to begin his interviews. Somewhere within these well-dressed souls, someone had committed a murder not out of rage, but design. And design, after all, was something Hercule Poirot understood perfectly. Poirot surveyed the room with a practiced eye, absorbing every detail. The faintest scent of lavender mingled with the sharp tang of fresh leather, and the luxurious fabrics hung about the walls like silent witnesses. He caught the glint of an ivory button, lost from a sleeve, perhaps the victim's, perhaps someone else's, and made a mental note. His mind already raced ahead, sorting through the pieces of this delicate puzzle. "Come," Poirot said to Radnor, his tone patient but firm. "We shall begin with the young man, Mr. Northcote. The apprentice is often the one closest to the action, is he not?" Radnor nodded, though the policeman's skepticism still hung in the air. He led Poirot towards the apprentice, who sat trembling in the far corner, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The lad's face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He could scarcely meet Poirot's gaze, avoiding eye contact like a man hiding something in plain view. "Daniel Northcote, is it?" Poirot's voice was calm, gentle almost, as he leaned slightly forward. "Tell me, mon ami, where were you when the murder occurred?" Northcote swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I was in the back room, sir, cutting fabric. I swear it, I didn't hear anything, not until I came out and saw Mr. Lemaitre sitting there by the fire." Poirot took a slow step closer. "But surely you must have heard the noise. The shears, for example, they are not quiet, non?" The apprentice flinched. I don't know, sir. I wasn't paying attention. I had work to do, and Mr. Lemaitre had been alone with Lord Chatterton in the front room for some time." Radnor leaned in. "And you didn't hear anything unusual? Not a cry? Not a sound?" Northcote shook his head, his nervousness almost palpable. I didn't hear anything. I only came out when I was called." Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. There was something off in the young man's story, a tension in the way his hands trembled beneath his sleeves, but Poirot said nothing more on the matter just yet. Instead, he stepped back and nodded for Radnor to move on. "We'll speak with Mr. Lemaitre next," Poirot said softly. Gaspard Lemaitre was still sitting by the fire, staring into the flickering flames as though seeking some kind of solace in their warmth. His face had regained some of its color, but his hands remained white-knuckled as they gripped the armrests. He did not look up as Poirot approached, though his shoulders stiffened ever so slightly at the detective's arrival. "Mr. Lemaitre," Poirot said, his voice like the smoothest velvet, "may I ask you to recount exactly what happened this morning?" The tailor took a long breath before speaking, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "I was in the shop when Lord Chatterton arrived. We exchanged pleasantries. He was here to finalize the fitting of his anniversary suit. He had always been a difficult customer, you see. Very particular about the cut and fabric. I left the room to fetch some more material when I heard nothing at all. I returned shortly after to find him like this." Poirot observed Lemaitre closely. The man's story was calm, too calm perhaps. His hands, however, told a different story. They were clasped tightly together, knuckles strained as if holding something back. He was a man who had seen a great deal in his life, that much was clear. Yet there was something unsettling about the way he described his actions, or rather, his lack of them. It seemed almost too rehearsed, as if he had prepared for such an inquiry. "You say you returned to find the body. Did you hear anything when you were outside the room? Any sound? A cry, perhaps?" Lemaitre shook his head firmly. "No, Monsieur Poirot. I heard nothing. The room was silent when I returned." Poirot's gaze softened. "And yet you were gone for a long time. Long enough, I imagine, for someone to commit such a crime. Perhaps you had enough time to arrange your return to the scene." Lemaitre stiffened, his eyes flickering for just a moment. "I assure you, Poirot, I did not—" "Non, non," Poirot interrupted gently. "I do not claim it, I suggest it. But tell me, Mr. Lemaitre, when you entered the room, was Lord Chatterton standing, or had he already collapsed?" The tailor faltered for a brief moment, and in that instant Poirot knew there was more to be unearthed here. Lemaitre's response was vague, his eyes darting towards the body as if it were a question to which he had no answer. He was on the floor," Lemaitre muttered. "Slumped. I cannot recall exactly how he had fallen." Poirot's lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. The truth, it seemed, was beginning to slip through the cracks of his carefully constructed tale. "Perhaps you had time to think about what to say when you returned, Monsieur Lemaitre?" Poirot asked, his voice cool, but his tone laced with curiosity. A man in shock has no time to construct such an explanation. Before Lemaitre could respond, a voice interrupted from the doorway. "You're asking the wrong questions, Poirot." It was Lady Eugenia Chatterton, her figure framed by the ornate door frame. She entered the room like a statue, her movements precise, calculated. Her eyes were cold, studying Poirot as though he were an experiment she was yet to decipher. The lady's appearance was impeccable, her posture regal, but there was something unnerving about her calmness, given the circumstances. "I beg your pardon, madame," Poirot replied, his gaze flicking up to her, "but I was merely—" "Enough of this," she interrupted, her voice crisp. "My husband is dead, and I find myself embroiled in your theatrics. You think it was Mr. Lemaitre, don't you?" Her lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Well, it wasn't. He's not the one who killed Adrian." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Ah, but who, then, would you suggest, Madame Chatterton?" Her eyes met his with unnerving precision. "That's for you to figure out, Poirot. But I suggest you stop wasting time on the inconsequential and start looking at the bigger picture." Poirot observed her carefully, noting the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched when she spoke. It wasn't grief that dominated her. It was something more dangerous, something colder. The woman was hiding something, but what? "Ah, but it is the smallest stitch that often unravels the entire fabric," Poirot said, his voice almost a whisper. "And you, Madame Chatterton, are a woman whose thread has been pulled." He turned his attention back to Lemaitre, his mind already working through the new layer of intrigue. Something was amiss here, and Poirot could feel the web tightening. One of these individuals was not just hiding the truth, they were actively weaving a new one. And as always, Poirot was certain of one thing. It was only a matter of time before the thread snapped and the real story came to light. Poirot studied Lady Chatterton for a long moment, his eyes tracing every nuance of her posture. There was a subtle tension in the way she held herself, a rigidity in her otherwise controlled manner. Her words had been calculated, her tone too controlled for a woman who had just lost her husband. Poirot's mind worked swiftly, but he said nothing immediately. He could see that the others in the room, Radnor included, were still absorbed in the larger narrative of the crime. They were looking for tangible evidence, fingerprints and footprints, but Poirot was playing a different game. "I must apologize, madame," Poirot finally said, his voice as smooth as ever. "But I must insist. It is my job, after all, to question everyone in this room. For you see, there are no innocents when it comes to a murder investigation. Only suspects and truths that have yet to be uncovered." Lady Chatterton's lips tightened slightly, but she said nothing more. Poirot turned back to Lemaitre. "I must ask you again, Monsieur Lemaitre," Poirot continued, his voice laced with calm insistence. "When you found Lord Chatterton, was there anything unusual about his posture, his expression, his attire? Did he appear to be in any way prepared for death?" Lemaitre shifted uneasily. "He was slumped, as I told you. His face, yes, it was contorted as though he had been surprised. But no, there was nothing about him that struck me as prepared. The suit was not yet fully fitted, the sleeve too long, and the trousers had not been hemmed. There were no signs of struggle." Poirot's gaze flickered to the suit that Lord Chatterton had been attempting to have tailored. The thought seemed to occur to him simultaneously with his next question. "Tell me, Monsieur Lemaitre, where exactly did you leave Lord Chatterton before stepping out for your coffee?" Lemaitre's face paled again as his fingers curled tighter around the armrest. "I left him at the fitting table, monsieur. Alone, as I have said. And when you came back, you found him still there upon the floor?" Lemaitre nodded slowly. "Yes, Poirot, that is correct." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, mentally retracing every word. Then he straightened and turned to the room in general. "It is curious," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "how something as simple as a tailor's fitting can lead to death. Curious indeed." A long silence followed, and it was clear that Lady Chatterton was growing impatient. She cleared her throat loudly, the sound a sharp disruption of the otherwise quiet tension that filled the room. "I'm sure the detective will find out soon enough," she said, her voice laced with something that could have been disdain. "But I do not have all day, Monsieur Poirot. My husband's murderer remains unapprehended, and you seem to be playing a rather unhelpful game." Poirot's eyes flicked to Lady Chatterton, then back to Lemaitre. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, his mind was working at a furious pace. He had not forgotten the smudge on the cuff of Northcott's sleeve, the twitch in Lemaitre's fingers, or the way Lady Chatterton had reacted when he asked about her husband's death. He was piecing together a portrait, not of a murder, but of a carefully constructed lie. "The crime was committed with precision, yes?" Poirot continued, his voice light, almost teasing. "The shears were placed perfectly, as if someone had measured the victim and knew precisely where to strike." "An unfortunate coincidence," Radnor muttered from the corner, still eyeing the young apprentice suspiciously. Poirot ignored him, his attention fully fixed on Lady Chatterton. "But I must ask, Madame Chatterton, how did you know your husband was in this shop today?" The question hung in the air, and Poirot saw her stiffen slightly. It was a momentary thing, a flash in her expression that might have gone unnoticed by others, but Poirot was never one to miss even the most fleeting of clues. "I am his wife," she replied evenly. "I know his habits. He always has a fitting when we are in London. He was to meet me after, as always." "And yet," Poirot went on, "you arrived after the crime was committed, did you not? The police were already here when you entered, and yet you speak of your husband as though you knew of his plans without hesitation. Too much ease in your words, madame." Lady Chatterton's eyes narrowed slightly, but she held her ground. "Perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you underestimate the bond between a wife and her husband." Poirot smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, the bond of trust. Yet one must wonder, trust is built on more than just habit, n'est-ce pas? You knew your husband would be here. But how, I wonder? You claim to have arrived after the police, yet your calmness suggests you were prepared for the event. Almost too prepared." Lady Chatterton's lips parted, but before she could respond, a commotion was heard from the outer hall. The sound of hurried footsteps reached the detective's ears, and a moment later, Maxwell Venn, the rival tailor, appeared in the doorway. His presence was like a storm. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his face pinched with irritation. "What is this nonsense?" Venn barked. "I've told you already, Lemaitre. I had no part in this. I came to this shop at the appointed time for a fitting, and I leave it at that." Poirot regarded Venn with quiet interest. The man was visibly agitated, pacing around the room with the nervous energy of a man trying to avoid something. He had the air of someone with more to hide than he was willing to admit. "You arrived?" "Yes," Poirot said, his voice cool. "But tell me, monsieur, did you leave immediately after your appointment? Or did you have time to witness something strange?" Venn stopped in his tracks, his eyes flashing briefly with a flicker of something, but it was gone in a heartbeat. "What are you implying, Poirot?" Poirot remained calm, his expression steady. "I merely ask if you noticed anything unusual when you arrived. Perhaps a sound, something out of place, yes? Or perhaps you saw a figure in the window." Venn hesitated, and Poirot pressed on. "You are too quick to deny everything, Monsieur Venn. This is often the behavior of a man who knows more than he wishes to reveal." Venn's face darkened, but it was Lady Chatterton who spoke up again, her voice rising sharply, almost as though she had been waiting for this moment. "Enough! What are we to do with this ridiculous circus? My husband is dead, and you're all chasing ghosts." Poirot's gaze flickered from one to the other, the room now filled with a palpable tension. It was a game now, one that none of them had quite realized they were playing, and each move made by Poirot was carefully calculated. It was clear to him now that this wasn't a simple case of jealousy or a rogue act of violence. This was deliberate, and whoever had killed Lord Adrian Chatterton had carefully planned every stitch of it, just as one would plan the construction of a fine suit. And as Poirot looked at each of them in turn, he knew one thing for certain. The real killer was hiding in plain sight. But for now, he would wait, watch, and listen. The game was far from over. Poirot's calm eyes flicked from the agitated Venn to the others in the room, gauging their reactions, noting the subtle shifts in body language. Venn's sudden entrance had thrown a new wrinkle into the investigation, but Poirot felt no sense of alarm. The scene was still in his control, every player unknowingly contributing to the larger picture. He could feel the weight of the mystery, heavy like a fabric yet to be cut to shape. Lady Chatterton stood near the window now, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the street below as though she could see through the building itself. She wasn't as calm as she appeared. Her fingers had begun to tap rhythmically on her arm, betraying a nervousness that was hard to ignore. Poirot took in the sight, but said nothing. There would be time for that later. Venn's presence was still looming in the room, like a storm cloud waiting to break. His agitation was palpable, the way his hand clenched and unclenched at his side, betraying his inner turmoil. Poirot knew the man would not be easily rattled. Tailors, after all, were accustomed to precision and patience. But something about his unease was not quite right. Poirot stood silently, letting the tension build, carefully considering how to proceed. He had observed the interactions, the subtle exchanges, the tone in which each individual spoke. The emotions were there, bubbling beneath the surface, and Poirot was patient. Ever patient. The truth would reveal itself, piece by piece. Finally, he broke the silence. "Monsieur Venn," he began, his voice soft, almost conversational. "You claim to have arrived at the shop at the appointed time, yet your arrival raises a question. Why, I wonder, do you seem so unsettled?" Venn's face darkened, the flicker of surprise quickly replaced by irritation. "I've already told you. I had an appointment, and I left. I saw nothing unusual." "And yet, monsieur," Poirot continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "there is a detail I have not yet mentioned. When you arrived, did you notice the peculiar arrangement of the fabrics on the table? They were not exactly how you would expect them to be. Venn stiffened at the mention of the fabrics. He hadn't expected Poirot to notice that, had he? The tailor's eyes darted briefly to the nearby table, where remnants of fabric lay scattered across the room, as if discarded carelessly. He swallowed, taking a deep breath before answering. "What does that matter?" Venn shot back, trying to sound nonchalant. "The man was murdered, yes? Is that not enough?" Poirot, unmoved, stepped closer to the table, running a finger along one of the bolts of fabric. "Ah, but it is precisely that which interests me. When you walked in, Monsieur Venn, were you not surprised by the fabric? It was as though someone had made a hurried decision, a hasty arrangement, no care, no attention to detail." Venn looked away, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is ridiculous." Poirot observed Venn for a moment longer, then turned his gaze back to the room. He was not ready to press further. There was something deeper here, something Venn was deliberately avoiding, but Poirot was content to let the pressure build. He was sure the man would crack soon enough. Instead, Poirot redirected his attention to the one who had remained eerily quiet during the entire exchange. Lady Chatterton. Her eyes met his briefly before she looked away, her posture tightening ever so slightly. The moment was enough. Poirot was sure of it now. "You, madame," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the thick silence. "You're not entirely honest with us. Your reactions are too controlled, too rehearsed. Tell me, why did you not mention that your husband was having an affair?" The words hung in the air, hanging heavier than Poirot had anticipated. Lady Chatterton's eyes widened, her lips parting as though she had been struck. What did you say?" she stammered, clearly caught off guard. Poirot's gaze did not waver. He was looking not at her face, but at her hands, those hands that were now twisting the fabric of her dress, the fingers working with increasing tension. "I said, madame, that I believe you know of the affair. You must. It explains much of your behavior today. You arrived at the shop after your husband's death, yet you knew exactly what to say. You were prepared, almost too prepared." Lady Chatterton took a step back, her face flushed, but her eyes sharp with anger now. That's preposterous. How dare you insinuate such a thing?" "Ah," Poirot said, raising a finger in a gesture of quiet authority. "But it is not I who insinuates. It is your own actions, madame, that tell the story, and your silence on the matter only deepens the mystery. For why would a wife of such perfect composure appear so unaware of what was happening in her own life? A life that was so carefully constructed." The words stung, and Lady Chatterton's composure faltered. She quickly recovered, but Poirot had seen enough. He knew what she was hiding now, and the pieces were beginning to align. But there was still more. The fabric on the table, the way it had been hastily arranged, had more significance than he'd first believed. And there was something about the tailor's nervousness, his refusal to engage more fully with the details, that screamed of an unspoken truth. A sharp, sudden noise interrupted his thoughts. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching quickly from the hallway. A moment later, a man in a dark uniform appeared in the doorway. "Detective Poirot," the man said, breathless, his face flushed with urgency. "There's something you need to see." Poirot raised an eyebrow, signaling for the man to approach. "What is it, my good man?" The officer hesitated for a moment, then held out a crumpled letter. "We found this, sir. It was hidden in Lord Chatterton's coat pocket. A note, one he must have intended to give to someone before he was killed." Poirot accepted the note, unfolding it carefully. His eyes skimmed over the elegant script, the words revealing the message with unnerving clarity. "Tonight, the truth will come to light. Meet me at the tailor's shop. Come alone. A friend." Poirot looked up, the pieces clicking into place. A friend, Poirot murmured, turning the note over as if expecting more. But there was nothing else. No signature, no hint of who might have sent it. Only the haunting words, which now carried a weight of certainty. The mystery had grown more complicated. A hidden communication, a secret rendezvous, and now the quiet, accusing silence of the room. Poirot knew that the answer to this case lay not just in the physical evidence, but in the psyche of those standing before him, and he was closer than ever to unearthing the truth. Poirot held the note in his hands for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the elegant handwriting as though it were a puzzle waiting to be solved. The words leapt off the paper, their meaning growing clearer with each passing second. "Tonight the truth will come to light," they read. A summons, an invitation to the tailor's shop at the very heart of this sordid affair. The urgency was palpable. The room grew quiet as Poirot folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. The detective's gaze lingered on each person in turn, his silence heavy with expectation. Lady Chatterton stood rigid, her eyes darting toward the door, while Ven's face had turned pale, his hands now twisted into anxious fists. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Something was about to break. Poirot's sharp voice sliced through the thick atmosphere. "Madame, Monsieur Ven," he said slowly, "there is more at play here than mere chance. The note, it confirms much, does it not?" Lady Chatterton flinched at the mention of the note, her perfectly manicured fingers now pressed tightly together as though she were holding her composure by sheer force of will. "I don't understand what you're implying," she said, her voice taut, though it was impossible to conceal the flicker of fear in her eyes. "There's no meaning in those words. They're just a note." Ven, for his part, had become increasingly agitated. "You're wrong, Poirot. I don't know anything about this note or any meeting. I've told you everything I know." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his piercing eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he studied Ven. There was something about the man's tone that sounded rehearsed, too polished, too defensive. Poirot had learned long ago that the truth often hid behind what was said, but even more behind what was not. "The note," Poirot continued, his tone never rising above the calm, methodical cadence that was his hallmark. "It mentions a friend who wishes to reveal the truth. But what truth, I wonder? And why meet in the tailor's shop of all places?" Lady Chatterton's posture stiffened further, her gaze turning to the window as though she was seeking an escape from Poirot's scrutiny. "You're grasping at straws," she muttered, but Poirot could see the way her lips trembled as she spoke. "You can't possibly expect me to know about this. Whoever wrote it, they must have been trying to frame someone." Poirot said nothing, instead turning his gaze to Ven. The tailor's reactions were becoming more erratic, his attempts at composure now overtaken by his growing discomfort. He shifted on his feet, his hand again twitching near his side. Poirot made a mental note of the subtle body, language. Something was not right. "Ah, Monsieur Ven," Poirot said softly, the words cutting through the growing tension like a scalpel. "You claim to be innocent of any involvement, yet you stand before us with so much nervousness. It is not the behavior of a man who has nothing to hide." "No?" Ven's face flushed a deep red as he opened his mouth to protest. But Poirot was already moving forward, his mind working quickly. He could see it now. The signs, the clues that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of Ven's words and actions. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot pressed, his voice smooth as velvet. "You knew that Lord Chatterton's affair was public knowledge. His marriage to Lady Chatterton, it was not a happy one, was it? You were his tailor, and yet you never mentioned the fact that he and your employer were at odds." Ven's eyes widened, a momentary flicker of panic crossing his face. It was brief, but it was there. Poirot took note. I didn't know anything about an affair," Ven stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "I've never had any personal dealings with Lord Chatterton's marriage. I was only a servant to him, a tailor." Poirot studied Venn for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. The man's defensiveness was growing more pronounced, and Poirot could sense that the walls he had built around his secrets were beginning to crack. The detective moved toward him with slow deliberation, watching his every movement, reading every shift of expression. "You are certain, Monsieur Venn, that you have never seen Lady Chatterton and your employer in a compromising situation?" Poirot's words were smooth, but there was an underlying weight to them, an implication that could not be ignored. Venn froze, his eyes darting to Lady Chatterton, then back to Poirot. The hesitation was telling. Poirot's mind raced as he pieced together the jigsaw puzzle. There was something here, something connecting Venn, Lady Chatterton, and Lord Chatterton, something that didn't add up. The lies were piling up, but the truth was inching closer, no matter how carefully they tried to conceal it. Before Poirot could press further, the officer who had brought the note stepped forward again, this time with an urgent message. "Poirot," the officer said, his voice trembling, "we've found something else. It's a body, in the alley behind the tailor's shop." Poirot's mind clicked into action, every nerve alive with the thrill of the hunt. The sudden appearance of this new detail shifted the investigation into a new realm. Another body, another murder. Was this connected to Lord Chatterton's death, or was it a diversion? Poirot's eyes flashed with sharp understanding. Without a word, he turned on his heel, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he headed toward the door. The officer followed, and Poirot gestured for the others to stay behind. The puzzle was still not complete, but the missing piece was now within reach. As he stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, the streets of London growing darker as the evening descended. Poirot's mind was racing, but there was no panic, no sense of urgency beyond the need for clarity. He had been handed the next thread to follow. In the alley, the scene was just as grim as he had feared. A body, another tailor perhaps, or a worker from the shop, lay sprawled in a pool of blood, eyes wide and unseeing. Poirot knelt beside the body, his fingers tracing the edges of the wounds, feeling for the slightest detail that might reveal the identity of the killer. The officer standing next to him watched in silence. Poirot looked up, his gaze cold. This, it seems, is not a coincidence. No, this is part of something much larger. A deliberate act of misdirection. The officer nodded, but Poirot's mind was already moving, already calculating the next steps. The pieces were falling into place, but there was one final twist to be uncovered, a revelation that would bring everything into sharp focus. And he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the truth was closer than ever. The body in the alley behind the tailor's shop was that of a young man in his mid-20s, smartly dressed but unmistakably lifeless, his blood seeping between the cobblestones. Poirot knelt beside the corpse, his gloved hands deftly examining the clothing and pockets. He took in every detail, the cut of the coat, the torn stitching on the collar, a faint whiff of lavender on the scarf around the man's neck. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. "Who found him?" Poirot asked softly, rising to his feet and glancing at the constable. "One of the neighbors. Came out to put out the rubbish and spotted the body lying there, still warm. Called us immediately. No one saw anyone fleeing the scene." Poirot nodded, his mind ticking over at speed. He turned back to the body. "He has not been dead long," he murmured. "Perhaps an hour. No identification on him?" "Nothing except this." The constable handed Poirot a slim card wallet. Inside was a folded paper, unsigned but familiar in tone and style. Poirot read it silently. "Tonight I speak the truth. At last someone will hear what they silenced before." Poirot's brow furrowed. "So," he said almost to himself, "another note, another message. But this one undelivered. Mon Dieu, it is almost theatrical." He turned sharply to the constable. "You must seal this area, and I wish to know the names of all the employees of Venn's tailoring business, past and present. This man, he was no stranger to the shop. I am certain of it. As Poirot stepped back into the street, the smell of rain threatened in the air. He walked briskly, cane tapping against the stones, deep in thought. The note found earlier, the invitation to a nocturnal revelation. Was it connected to this man's death? Had he been the intended source of information? If so, someone had silenced him before he could speak. Back at the Chatterton residence, the drawing room was subdued when Poirot returned. Hastings stood by the fireplace, clearly worried, while Lady Chatterton sat with her arms folded tightly, her face now drained of its earlier confidence. Mr. Venn paced near the French windows, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings were being tugged by nervous hands. Poirot addressed them calmly. There has been another development. A man has been found dead behind the tailor's shop. He was carrying a note, unsigned, but similar in tone to the one I received earlier. It appears, mes amis, that someone wished to confess, and someone else wished desperately to prevent that. Lady Chatterton's hand flew to her mouth. Another death? But what does this mean? Is there a killer stalking us now? Poirot ignored her question, instead stepping toward Venn. Monsieur Venn, does your shop employ a man in his mid-20s, about 5'8", dark hair, slight frame, perhaps someone who handles deliveries or fittings? Venn's voice cracked. I don't know. We have apprentices, yes. One or two, but you do not know, Poirot interrupted, gently but firmly. How curious. A man is dead. You cannot recall the faces of those who work under your own roof? Venn hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. We had an apprentice, Charles Bray, but he left several weeks ago. Personal reasons, he said. Did he resign, or was he dismissed? Poirot asked, his eyes narrowing. Venn hesitated again. He was let go. He'd started behaving strangely. Distracted, late, nervous. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Was he nervous because of something he had done? Or something he had witnessed, perhaps? Venn opened his mouth, then closed it again. His expression gave away nothing, but Poirot knew the man was weighing his words. Every second of silence was a confirmation of guilt, not necessarily of murder, but of concealment. Tell me about Lord Chatterton's last visit to your shop, Poirot said. Venn blinked. There was nothing unusual about it. He came for a final fitting. He had a short temper, as always, but nothing stood out. Poirot stepped closer. Nothing stood out? You're certain? Then let me ask differently. Did he argue with anyone? Did young Charles Bray witness anything? There was another long pause. Lady Chatterton glanced sharply at Venn, who finally exhaled as though deflating. He overheard something, Venn said. I don't know how much. He came to me after Chatterton's final visit and said he wanted to quit, that he didn't want to be involved. I assumed he'd been snooping and heard something he shouldn't have. And what was it, this thing he should not have heard? Poirot asked quietly. I don't know, truly, but afterward he changed. Lady Chatterton rose from her chair. This is absurd. If a disgruntled apprentice overheard a client being difficult, why should that lead to murder? You're turning a tailor's gossip into conspiracy. Poirot's voice was as mild as ever, but it sliced through her protest. No, madame, gossip does not murder, but the fear of a truth revealed, that can indeed become deadly. He turned suddenly to Hastings. My friend, we must visit the shop tonight, the alley where the body was found. There may be traces the killer left in haste, and the shop itself may yet yield secrets. Before they could depart, a knock at the door interrupted them. The butler entered with an envelope. Poirot took it and opened it without comment. Inside was a single sheet of paper in the same handwriting as the two notes before. This time I send no warning. Tonight ends in silence. Poirot handed the paper to Hastings. You see, mon ami, The killer grows bolder, less cryptic, more dangerous. The game accelerates. Within the hour, they stood outside Ven's tailor shop once more. The street was eerily quiet. Poirot unlocked the door with a key obtained from the police and stepped inside. The room was unchanged from earlier, precisely arranged, fabric bolts stacked neatly, the ghost of a dead man hanging in the air. Poirot moved with quiet precision, his eyes scanning every inch of the space. He touched nothing. He allowed the room to speak. It was the dressing area that drew his attention. The curtain still hung half-pulled, the large mirror reflecting the work table behind him. Poirot stepped inside and studied the floor. His gaze halted at a faint smear near the edge of the rug. He knelt and pulled it back. There, a hidden trap-door, cleverly concealed. He examined the latch. "Locked," he murmured, "but only just. Recently." Hastings leaned closer. "Do you think that leads to a cellar?" "Perhaps. Or a hidden storeroom. But someone thought it necessary to keep it secret. That is reason enough to be curious." He straightened and nodded to the constable nearby. "We shall have it opened. Immediately." As the officer fetched tools, Poirot turned back to the dressing area. A faint scent lingered in the air. Not blood nor mold, but something sharp. Chemical. Clean. He stepped closer to the mirror. Behind the mirror, a smudge. Not dust. Lipstick. Poirot tilted his head. A message. He reached behind it and pulled free a folded scrap of paper torn from a notebook. He read it once. Twice. Then his face went utterly still. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "So that is the truth." He turned to Hastings, his expression grave. "The next move, Hastings, is not ours. It is the killer's, and they are nearly ready to strike again." Poirot stared down at the scrap of paper in his hands, the words printed in an uneven hand. It was a simple message, and yet it struck with the force of a hammer to the chest. The tailor knew too much. The words were undeniably a declaration, but of what? What truth had been uncovered that had cost this man his life? Why did someone fear the tailor's knowledge so fiercely? Poirot could sense the fragile tension in the air, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Someone had been playing a game far more dangerous than a mere murder. It was a conspiracy of silence, of buried secrets, and of hidden knowledge. "What do you make of it, mon ami?" Poirot asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Hastings, who had been watching Poirot with growing unease, frowned. "It's a message, of course, but what does it mean? The tailor knew too much about what?" Poirot's lips tightened into a thin smile. "Ah, my dear Hastings, that is the very question we must answer, for that is the key to unlocking the mystery." Hastings shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "But where do we even start looking? It's all so muddled." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, eyes scanning the room. He seemed to take in every detail, every corner, every object with his usual fastidiousness. There was something almost mechanical in the way his mind processed the information, assembling the pieces of the puzzle with effortless precision. It was as if he could see the hidden threads weaving through the room, connecting objects, people, and events that everyone else would have missed. Poirot turned sharply. "We begin with the tailor, of course, the shop itself. We must learn what he knew, what he heard, and who might have had reason to silence him." The constable, who had been standing by, now moved forward, his face pale from the recent events. "Sir, we've opened the trap-door in the back. There's a small room below, but nothing of immediate interest. Just old fabric and some unused tailoring tools." Poirot considered this for a moment. "Very well, but I would like to inspect it myself. Perhaps there is something there that you missed." The constable led them down into the cramped room, which smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. It was cluttered with old cloths, bolts of fabric, and scraps of unfinished garments. The walls were lined with shelves that held boxes of buttons, needles, and thread. There was nothing particularly out of the ordinary, except for the faint sense of abandonment that hung in the air. Poirot stepped carefully around the room, his gaze sharp and calculating. He paused at a corner where a small, overturned box sat, spilling its contents, a collection of old receipts and bits of thread. With deliberate slowness, Poirot bent to examine them, picking up one receipt in particular. "Ah," he murmured, holding it up. "What have we here?" It was a receipt for a delivery, signed by none other than Charles Bray, the apprentice. The date on the receipt was just a few days before Bray had supposedly left the shop. Poirot turned the paper over, his eyes narrowing. There was a peculiar note written in the corner, almost illegible, but still decipherable. "Needle and thread will not fix this. The truth is waiting." Poirot's face tightened as he folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "This, Hastings, is the clue I was waiting for." "What does it mean?" Hastings asked, though it was clear he was only half sure of what Poirot was getting at. "It means," Poirot said, rising to his feet, "that Charles Bray was not only aware of something, he was involved in something. And this message suggests that whatever it was serious enough to bring him to the edge, perhaps even to the point of death." They left the tailor's shop quickly, Poirot's mind racing. This discovery about Bray added another layer of complexity to the case, and the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the tailor's death was not a simple murder, but part of a much larger, far more dangerous scheme. Back at the Chatterton residence, Poirot found Lady Chatterton pacing the drawing room anxiously. Her husband had not yet returned, and she was growing increasingly agitated. "Poirot, do you have any answers yet?" she asked as soon as he entered, her eyes desperate for reassurance. Poirot gave her a polite but firm smile. "Madame, I'm not yet certain, but I believe we are very close to uncovering the full truth." Lady Chatterton's face tightened with concern. "You keep saying that, but who, Poirot? Who is responsible for all of this? Why is it all happening now?" Poirot hesitated, his fingers idly tapping his cane. "Ah, madame, that is what I intend to discover, but rest assured, I believe the key to this mystery lies in one person's secret, a secret that they will do anything to protect." Hastings, who had been standing near the window, looked up. "Do you mean the tailor, Poirot?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, the tailor knew something. He overheard a conversation, witnessed something, perhaps he was even part of it. But whatever it was, someone wanted him dead to silence him." "But why him?" Hastings asked. "What did he know that was so important?" Poirot's lips curled into a smile, though his eyes remained serious. "That, my friend, is what we are about to find out." At that moment, the doorbell rang sharply, and the butler entered with an envelope in hand. Poirot's heart skipped a beat as he took it from the man and tore it open. The message inside was simple, but chilling. "The tailor was only the first. There are more who must be silenced." Poirot's hand clenched the paper tightly as he turned toward Hastings. His voice was low and steady, but filled with the weight of the discovery. "Mon ami, it appears our killer is not finished. We must act quickly. There are lives at stake, and the truth, well, that is something they will do anything to keep hidden." Without another word, Poirot turned toward the door, his mind racing ahead, already calculating their next move. The game was nearing its end, but the final act would not come easily. Whoever was behind these deaths was clever, ruthless, and still very much in the shadows. But Poirot would find them. He always did. Poirot stood still for a moment, the weight of the note in his hands pressing heavily on his mind. The cryptic message inside echoed in his thoughts. The tailor was only the first. There are more who must be silenced. It was chilling, the kind of warning that hinted at an ongoing conspiracy, a deeper web of intrigue that reached far beyond the death of a single man. He could feel the faintest stirrings of a larger, more complicated plan, one that involved more lives, more secrets, and more shadows than he had yet uncovered. He turned to Hastings, who was looking at him with growing concern. "What is it, Poirot? What does it mean?" Poirot folded the note carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket, his brow furrowing with concentration. "It means, mon ami, that the killer is not finished. The tailor, although vital to the case, was merely a stepping stone. Whoever is behind this does not intend to stop here." Hastings' face paled slightly. "But if they've already killed one person, why stop at just the tailor? Why leave it at that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "There are forces at work here that we do not yet fully understand, but one thing is clear. The death of the tailor was a message, a warning to those who might threaten the secrecy of something far more dangerous than a mere murder. We must act quickly before it becomes too late." The room seemed to close in around them, the stillness only broken by the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. Poirot's mind raced, connecting threads he had gathered, each piece of information shifting into place like a puzzle nearing its completion. Yet there was something elusive, something lingering in the air that he could not quite grasp. The killer was careful, calculating, but that very carelessness, the notion that they were already one step ahead, was exactly what Poirot had come to rely on. "I'll gather the others," Hastings said, his voice hesitant but determined. He had known Poirot long enough to understand that his friend was already thinking several steps ahead. "Oui, but there is something we must first consider," Poirot replied, as his mind returned to the details he had gathered from the tailor's shop. "The last clue we uncovered, the receipt signed by Charles Bray, suggests a connection between Bray and the tailor, but I do not believe it to be purely incidental. The message on the paper, needle and thread, will not fix this. The truth is waiting, implies something far deeper, a matter that has yet to be revealed." Hastings frowned. "But we've already spoken to Bray. He's a simple man, isn't he? A young apprentice, nothing more." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Ah, Hastings, that is precisely the problem. Bray may be a simple man, but simple men often carry the heaviest burdens. I suspect that Bray's involvement is more than mere coincidence. We must speak with him again. There is something in his demeanor that I overlooked, something he is hiding." Hastings nodded, already moving toward the door. "I'll get the constable. We can bring Bray in." Poirot remained in the drawing room, his eyes fixed on the door as Hastings left. A quiet sense of anticipation settled over him as he stood there, thinking of all the possible answers that still eluded him. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, but the threads of the case were beginning to tighten around him. Whoever was orchestrating this chaos was growing desperate, and in desperation there would be mistakes, small missteps, inconsistencies that Poirot would exploit to bring the truth to light. Moments later, Hastings returned, followed by the young apprentice, Charles Bray. Bray's nervous eyes darted around the room, his hands wringing anxiously in front of him. He looked even younger than Poirot had remembered, with his unkempt hair and the ill-fitting suit that hung awkwardly on his thin frame. Poirot motioned for Bray to sit, his gaze calm but probing. "Monsieur Bray, I must apologize for disturbing you once more. There are still a few things I must understand. It is important, you see, that you tell me everything you know about your master, Monsieur Orville." Bray shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flickering to the door as if hoping for a quick escape. "I told you everything, sir. There's nothing more to say." Poirot's voice was soft but insistent. "I beg to differ, Monsieur Bray. The message your master left behind, the receipt you signed for him, suggests there is more to be uncovered. I believe you know something vital that will help us understand the true reason behind Monsieur Orville's death." Bray swallowed, his face turning pale. I don't know what you mean. I swear, I didn't kill him." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze unblinking. "Monsieur Bray, I do not accuse you of murder, but I do suspect that you are hiding something. The message your master left behind was not one of confusion, but of warning. What did he know, Monsieur Bray? What was he trying to tell us before he was silenced?" Bray's hands shook as he clenched them tightly in his lap. I can't tell you, sir. You wouldn't understand." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, but I would, Monsieur Bray. You see, I understand more than you think. Now you will speak to me, and you will tell me the truth. What was your master involved in? What did he uncover?" Bray seemed to wilt under Poirot's unyielding gaze, his defiance crumbling. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was part of something illegal. I didn't know the details, but I heard them talk. He and his associates. It had to do with blackmail. They were all involved in it, sir. High society types who use their power and wealth to ruin others. And Orville, he was going to expose them. That's why he was killed, isn't it?" Poirot's mind raced as Bray's confession settled in. Blackmail, high society criminals. It all fit. The tailor had known too much, and he had been silenced to prevent him from revealing the truth. But who was behind it? Who among the elite had the power to orchestrate such a plot? And who else would be next? "Monsieur Bray," Poirot said quietly, "you have given me much to think about, but you must tell me more. Who were these people? Who else was involved?" Bray shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know their names. All I know is what I heard in fragments. Orville had collected evidence, but he didn't trust anyone. He said he was going to go to the authorities, but he never did." Poirot finished for him, a cold certainty settling in. "No, Monsieur Bray, I believe someone silenced your master before he could act on that plan, and now we are left with only the remnants of his secrets." As Bray nodded weakly, the door opened once more, and Hastings stepped in, his face grim. "Poirot, we've just received word. Another body has been found. The widow, Lady Chatterton, has been attacked." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The threads of this case were tightening faster than he had anticipated, and now, with another life hanging in the balance, the clock was ticking. Poirot's eyes narrowed with sudden focus, as Hastings' words hung heavily in the air. The news of Lady Chatterton's attack was like a thunderclap in the quiet room. The widow had been a prominent figure in the same circles as Orville, a woman whose wealth and influence had made her a target for those who dealt in the darker, more dangerous corners of society. To think that she, too, was now embroiled in this deadly game was enough to set Poirot's mind racing. "We must move swiftly, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice sharp. He rose from his chair, the steady rhythm of his movements betraying none of the anxiety that had begun to stir beneath his composed exterior. "Every moment we delay, the possibility of another life lost becomes more certain. The killer is bold, growing bolder with each act, but they are also making mistakes." Hastings nodded, his expression serious. "What are we going to do, Poirot?" Poirot turned to the young apprentice, who sat in silence, still looking shell-shocked. "Monsieur Bray, you will remain here," Poirot instructed. "If there is anything more you wish to say, I advise you to do so now, but you must stay out of our way. We cannot afford distractions." Bray nodded mutely, his eyes wide with fear. He had given them what little information he could, and now there was nothing more he could offer. Poirot, however, could not afford to dwell on him for long. His thoughts were already racing toward Lady Chatterton and the implications of this new development. "Let us go, Hastings," Poirot continued, his voice firm with resolve. "Lady Chatterton must be our next focus. If we do not act immediately, the killer will have the chance to strike again. We must prevent that, no matter what the cost." The journey to Lady Chatterton's estate was a blur of motion, the townhouses and grand mansions blurring past them as Poirot remained lost in thought. His mind was calculating, turning over every detail of the case. It was no longer just about the death of the tailor. The puzzle had grown exponentially, and with each new piece, Poirot felt closer to the truth. When they arrived at the estate, a sense of foreboding greeted them. The large iron gates that led to Lady Chatterton's home seemed to creak in the wind, as if signaling the unrest that was brewing just beyond the surface of polite society. The house, with its tall, imposing columns and grand facade, looked serene enough from the outside, but Poirot knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had seen enough to know that within those walls, secrets festered. Lady Chatterton herself had already been taken to her chambers, where she was being tended to by her doctor. She had been found unconscious in her study, an apparent attack having left her in a state of shock. Fortunately, it seemed she had not suffered any lasting physical injury, though the emotional toll had already begun to take its effect. The maid who had discovered her was still in the room, speaking in low tones to the constables who had secured the premises. Poirot's first priority was to speak with Lady Chatterton directly. He needed to understand what had transpired, what she had known, and how her life might be connected to the larger conspiracy he was now piecing together. The maid, who had been standing by the door, stepped aside as Poirot and Hastings entered the room. Lady Chatterton sat propped up in bed, her face pale, her once flawless features now drawn and weary. Her eyes flickered toward Poirot as he entered, and he could see a faint trace of fear in them. Yet there was also something else, a hint of recognition, as though she had known this moment would come, that her involvement in this affair could no longer be hidden. Poirot approached her slowly, with the same measured steps that he always took when confronting the most delicate of situations. He was aware of the vulnerability in the room, the widow's shattered composure, the lingering air of danger, and he knew that the answers would not come easily. "Lady Chatterton," Poirot began, his voice soft but firm, "I am terribly sorry for the distress you have suffered, but I must ask you, what happened here tonight? Can you tell me who attacked you?" The widow's lips trembled slightly, and she cast a quick glance toward the maid, who stood at the edge of the room, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I don't know, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice faltering. I was working in my study, just as I always do in the evenings. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps. When I turned around, there was someone there, someone I did not recognize. Before I could cry out, they struck me." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. The attack seemed spontaneous, a random act of violence. Yet there was something in the widow's tone, a sense of controlled fear, that suggested there was more to this story than she was willing to admit. "You did not see their face, Lady Chatterton?" Poirot asked carefully. She shook her head, her expression pained. "No, it all happened so quickly. I barely had time to register anything before I felt a sharp pain at the back of my head, and then nothing." Poirot's mind began to work, unraveling the inconsistencies in her statement. It was true that the shock of an unexpected attack could cloud one's memory, but Poirot could not help but wonder if Lady Chatterton's fear was masking a deeper knowledge, perhaps a knowledge that she was unwilling to share. "Lady Chatterton, forgive me if I am too forward," Poirot continued, his voice soothing yet insistent. "But I must ask you, do you know of anyone who might wish you harm? Someone who might have a motive for such an attack?" For a long moment, Lady Chatterton did not answer. Her eyes darted around the room as though searching for the right words, or perhaps for the courage to speak them. Finally, she sighed heavily, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "There is something," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Something I have been trying to keep hidden. I didn't think it would come to this." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Please, Lady Chatterton, you must tell me, for your safety and for the safety of others." She swallowed hard, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I was involved with Orville. He knew things about people, things that could ruin them, and he had collected evidence. He said he was going to expose the blackmail ring, but I feared for my reputation. I feared that if it came out, I would be ruined too. Poirot's mind raced as the pieces began to click together. Blackmail, power, desperation. Lady Chatterton had been caught in the same net of danger as the tailor, perhaps even as a participant in the scheme. The killer's actions were not random. They were driven by fear, by the need to silence those who knew too much. And now, the killer knows that you too hold a key to the truth, Poirot said softly, his voice filled with understanding. That is why you were attacked, Lady Chatterton. Someone wants to make sure that the secrets of the past stay buried. Her eyes widened as she realized the full extent of Poirot's deduction. But who would do such a thing? She whispered, her voice trembling. Poirot's gaze was steady as he replied, That, Lady Chatterton, is what I intend to find out. But know this. The answers are closer than you think, and the killer's next move is likely already set in motion. We must act quickly before another life is lost. Poirot's eyes lingered on Lady Chatterton, who seemed visibly shaken by the revelations she had just shared. Her earlier composure had cracked, revealing a woman caught in the web of a dangerous game. Her confession that she had once been involved with Orville and that she knew of the blackmail added an unexpected complexity to the case. It was clear now that the attack on her was not a random act of violence, but part of something far more intricate. Thank you, Lady Chatterton, Poirot said, his voice as gentle as it was firm. I know this is difficult, but your honesty is crucial. Now, we must take action, for we are running out of time. Lady Chatterton gave a small nod, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. But who would want to kill us all? What's the endgame in all this? Poirot paused, considering her question carefully. He had always prided himself on his ability to read the smallest cues, to find the threads that connected seemingly unrelated events. Now, more than ever, he could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. It wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about untangling a conspiracy, one that, if left unchecked, could destroy lives far beyond the ones already lost. Hastings, Poirot said suddenly, his sharp eyes turning to his companion. We must return to the tailor's workshop. There is something there that has been overlooked. I'm sure of it. Hastings raised an eyebrow but nodded. The workshop? But Poirot, surely we've already gone over it thoroughly. Poirot shook his head, his expression resolute. It is not enough to simply search. We must understand what we are looking for. There is a difference between finding something and truly seeing it. With that, Poirot led Hastings out of the estate, their journey back to the tailor's workshop feeling urgent and purposeful. As they arrived, the evening air had grown chilly, and Poirot wasted no time in directing Hastings to accompany him inside. The scent of fabric and wood greeted them, mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of blood that Poirot could still detect, despite the time that had passed since the initial investigation. The workshop was exactly as they had left it. Disorganized, with piles of fabric strewn about and shelves cluttered with tools and half-finished garments. But as Poirot moved through this space, his eyes narrowed in concentration. It was no longer the chaotic disarray that had caught his attention earlier. Now, it was the details that mattered. He stopped near the desk where the tailor had been working. His hand brushed lightly over the surface, moving past scraps of paper and sewing needles, until it stopped on a small leather-bound book tucked behind a stack of cloth. Ah, mon ami, Poirot murmured, lifting the book carefully. This, I believe, is what we have been searching for. Hastings looked over Poirot's shoulder. What is it? It is not a book, Poirot said, turning it in his hands. It is a ledger of sorts, a record of transactions, perhaps, or a list of names. Hastings frowned. Transactions? You think this is related to the blackmail? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped open the book with a slow, deliberate motion. The pages inside were filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple account book with figures and names lined up in columns, but Poirot's sharp eyes soon landed on something that made his heart race. Two names repeated several times in various sections of the ledger. One of the names was Orville's, the other was Lady Chatterton's. Poirot's fingers traced the entries carefully, each entry growing darker and more sinister as he studied it. There were dates that matched the night of Orville's death. There were figures, codes, and cryptic notations that, taken together, pointed to a network of individuals involved in something far larger than a simple blackmail ring. "Here it is," Poirot said finally, his voice low with realization. "These are the connections. Orville and Lady Chatterton were not just victims. They were key players. They were both being used as pawns in a much larger game." "But how does this ledger explain the attack on Lady Chatterton?" Hastings asked, still struggling to connect the dots. If the killer wanted to silence them both, why attack her now? Poirot's lips curled into a small smile, but it was not a pleasant one. "The answer is simple, Hastings. The killer believes Lady Chatterton knows too much. She has been threatened, yes, but not to the same extent as Orville. No, the killer's plan was to remove him first. He was the one who had grown too dangerous. The tailor's murder was the beginning, but Lady Chatterton's life was to be the final blow." "But she didn't die," Hastings said, realization dawning. "The killer wasn't able to finish the job." "Precisely," Poirot confirmed, "which is why the killer will come again. They will not stop until the truth is buried, and Lady Chatterton, though she is unaware, holds the final piece of the puzzle." Hastings seemed to grasp the severity of the situation at last. "You think she'll be attacked again?" Poirot nodded, his expression grave. "I have no doubt of it, and this time the killer will not be so merciful." The air in the workshop grew heavy as the weight of Poirot's deductions settled over them. For a moment, neither man spoke. Poirot was already lost in thought, piecing together the puzzle in his mind. His eyes darted back to the ledger, his brain racing through the possibilities. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside the workshop door broke the silence. Poirot froze, his gaze flicking to the door. He motioned for Hastings to remain silent as the door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was the maid. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Monsieur Poirot, you must come quickly," she said, her voice trembling. "There's been another attack. Lady Chatterton. She's gone." Poirot stood up immediately, his face hardening with resolve. The time for deductions and speculation had passed. Now, action was required. "Lead the way," Poirot said curtly, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned to Hastings as they hurried toward the door. "I believe the killer is still in the house, Hastings. We must stop them before it is too late." As they followed the maid through the dimly lit halls of the estate, Poirot's mind was already working through the scenarios, calculating the killer's next move with a precision that only he could manage. There was no room for hesitation now. Lady Chatterton's life, and possibly others, hung in the balance. The final confrontation was imminent, and Poirot would not allow the killer to escape justice. Not now. Not ever. Poirot's mind was already several steps ahead, his thoughts racing as he followed the maid down the winding corridors of the estate. His every instinct told him that the killer had not yet given up on their goal. This was not just about eliminating witnesses. This was a matter of carefully controlled steps, a game that had been planned and executed with cold precision. The maid, leading them through the darkened hallways, was now shaking, her movements frantic. "She was fine just moments ago," she exclaimed in a near panic. "I left her in her room, but when I returned, there was no sign of her, just the door ajar and the room in disarray." Poirot didn't respond immediately. He was focused entirely on the faint sounds of movement echoing through the walls. sounds that suggested they were nearing the source of the chaos. It could be that Lady Chatterton was not yet lost, but if the killer was still there, time was running out. Every second was precious. They reached the door to Lady Chatterton's room. It was open, just as the maid had described, and the atmosphere within was chilling. The room had been turned upside down, furniture was askew, the curtains drawn tight, and papers scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the mess that caught Poirot's attention. It was the air, the silence, the absence of movement. It told him everything he needed to know. Poirot stepped into the room cautiously, scanning every corner. His gaze swept over the disarray, noting every detail: the broken mirror on the floor, the discarded dress on the bed, and the faint scent of perfume that hung in the air. He walked slowly toward the dressing table, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Hastings, observe the room carefully," Poirot instructed, his voice low and deliberate. "We must find what has been taken or disturbed." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration as he began to sift through the papers strewn across the floor. Poirot, however, had already honed in on something. A faint footprint on the carpet near the wardrobe, almost obscured by the mess, but clear enough to make out the shape of a shoe. Poirot knelt down, his fingers lightly brushing the fibers of the rug as he examined the footprint more closely. It was small, delicate, but unmistakable. This was not the type of mark left by a man. It was likely a woman's, and Poirot's mind leapt to conclusions, each one more troubling than the last. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot said, rising slowly, "what do you make of this footprint?" Hastings came over to inspect it, squinting as he looked down. "It's strange," he murmured, bending closer. "But how can a footprint help us now? Surely Lady Chatterton is the one we're concerned with. Do you think this is connected?" Poirot stood up, his expression unreadable. "I do not think that Lady Chatterton is the victim here, Hastings. I believe the victim is still in this house. The one who has been stalking her is still close by, and our quarry may have already taken another step." The implication hit Hastings like a physical blow. "You mean she's been abducted?" Poirot nodded, but his eyes never left the footprint. "Not necessarily. But there is something else at play. A second actor has entered the game, someone with their own agenda, and they are using Lady Chatterton as a pawn." The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in Poirot's mind, though they still felt elusive. He knew that Orville's murder, the blackmail, and Lady Chatterton's precarious position were linked, but the true nature of the conspiracy was still shrouded in uncertainty. Why would someone go to such lengths to keep her quiet? What was she truly hiding? The faint sound of a door creaking open broke his concentration. Poirot's sharp eyes darted toward the source of the noise, and to his surprise, he saw the figure of Lady Chatterton herself standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she was standing on her own, no signs of injury. "Lady Chatterton!" Hastings exclaimed, rushing forward, but Poirot held up a hand to stop him. "Not so fast, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice calm, though his mind was racing. "This is far from over." Lady Chatterton's gaze was glassy, as if she were seeing something far away, something that only she could understand. Her clothes were slightly disheveled, as if she had hastily dressed, but there was no sign of any struggle. I heard something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was in the hallway and I saw someone. It was a woman, but I don't know who. I thought I was imagining it. But she looked like me." Poirot's sharp eyes focused on her. This was not the typical behavior of someone who had just witnessed an attempted murder. Lady Chatterton wasn't frightened. She was disoriented, as though she were trapped in some sort of haze. Poirot's instincts were telling him that the answer lay in what she had seen, or what she thought she had seen. "Hastings, stay with her," Poirot said quickly. "There is something more to this. We need to get to the bottom of it." Poirot moved quickly through the estate once again, this time heading straight for the library. He felt a sense of urgency building within him, each passing moment increasing the weight of his realization. The culprit was not working alone. There was someone else in the shadows, someone who had been manipulating every piece of this investigation from the beginning. As he entered the library, Poirot's eyes scanned the room methodically. The large shelves were lined with books, but his gaze was focused on the desk at the far end, where several papers were stacked neatly. His fingers brushed over the edges of the papers, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw a familiar name. Orville. The name was mentioned again, but this time there were no cryptic entries, no mysterious figures. The paper was a letter, a final correspondence between Orville and another party. It had been hidden amongst the books. Poirot's eyes glinted as he unfolded the paper. What he read confirmed his suspicion. Orville had been writing to someone connected to the Chatterton family, someone with a hidden agenda. As Poirot read on, it became clear that Orville had uncovered something far darker than anyone had anticipated. This was no mere blackmail scheme. There were larger forces at work, manipulating the lives of those around them. The web of deceit stretched far beyond Lady Chatterton and Orville. His mind raced as he pieced together the connections, each one leading him closer to the truth. Someone had been pulling the strings all along, and now they were in the final stages of their plan. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his thoughts crystallizing with clarity. The killer would strike again. But Poirot was ready. The estate was unnervingly still as Poirot re-entered the hallway, the letter still clutched in his hand. His thoughts whirred with the information he had uncovered, each detail fitting into place like the teeth of an intricate lock. His suspicion had been correct. This was not just a simple murder. No, it was far more elaborate. Someone had planned this with remarkable precision, and it was no coincidence that Lady Chatterton was at the center of it all. He could almost feel the presence of the unseen hand pulling at the strings. The web of deceit had been carefully crafted, and now that Poirot had uncovered a piece of it, he knew that the final revelation was close at hand. The danger, however, was far from over. If his theory was right, another move would soon be made, one that could be far more lethal than any of them had imagined. Hastings, still in the drawing room with Lady Chatterton, looked up as Poirot entered. His face was grim, and his eyes were filled with concern. "Poirot, what is it? You look different. What have you found?" Poirot didn't immediately answer. Instead, he handed Hastings the letter. As the words were read, Poirot took a step back and observed the reactions closely. Hastings' eyes widened with surprise, but then his expression shifted to one of recognition, the lines of his face hardening as the full scope of the letter's contents became clear. It's connected to the family, isn't it?" Hastings said, his voice low and tense. "But this is much more than we thought. There are names here, names we haven't even considered." "Precisely," Poirot replied, his voice calm yet filled with the sharpness of his mind at work. "This is the key, Hastings. This letter, though written by Orville, was meant for someone else. Someone who knew everything, and that someone is tied directly to Lady Chatterton's past." Poirot turned his gaze to Lady Chatterton, who had been sitting motionless in the corner, her face pale and drawn. She seemed to be lost in thought, her eyes darting between the two men. "What is it, Lady Chatterton?" Poirot asked, his tone gentle yet probing. "Do you recognize the names in this letter?" Lady Chatterton flinched slightly at the question, as if the mere mention of Orville's name had triggered something deep within her. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the armchair. I know of them, yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I never imagined that they would come to this." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze fixed intently on her. "What did you know about Orville's relationship with these people? Was he blackmailing them too?" Lady Chatterton's gaze dropped to the floor as she struggled for words, clearly hesitant. "Orville had a way of finding things Things about people, secrets that no one else knew. He told me once that he had uncovered something about a member of the Chatterton family, something very dangerous, but he swore me to secrecy. He said he would handle it himself. I never thought that it would come to this. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. The pieces were falling into place, but there was something still elusive about the entire situation. What had Orville discovered that was so dangerous? And why had he been murdered for it? What could possibly justify the lengths to which someone had gone to silence him? Hastings, clearly troubled by the conversation, placed the letter on the table in front of him. But who would go to such lengths, Poirot? These people seem untouchable. Why not let Orville expose them? Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. That is the very question we must answer, my friend. Who, indeed? He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds of the estate. The answer, he knew, was right in front of them. They had been looking at the situation all wrong. The key wasn't in the names themselves, it was in the family ties, the relationships, the hidden motives. Orville had been silenced because he knew something about someone important, something that could have destroyed their carefully constructed facade. Poirot turned to face the others once more. It is time to speak with the others. We have made many assumptions, but it is time to see if they hold any merit. Lady Chatterton, I ask you to come with us. There is much more to uncover. Reluctantly, she rose from her chair and followed them into the hallway. Poirot's mind was already at work, analyzing the situation further. As they walked, he glanced at each door they passed, mentally cataloguing the rooms and the people within. The web of deceit was closing in around them, but he knew that the final moments of this investigation would require the sharpest of insights. They made their way to the study, where the family had gathered earlier. There, Poirot began his meticulous questioning, careful to take note of every movement, every hesitation, every telltale sign of guilt. The suspects were still largely unaware of the danger they were in. Lady Chatterton, for her part, had seemed oblivious to the growing threat, but Poirot knew that the answer lay somewhere within her history, somewhere hidden beneath layers of lies. One by one he questioned the family members. Each one seemed outwardly composed, but Poirot's sharp eye noticed subtle shifts in their behavior, the way they avoided certain questions, the way they hesitated before responding. It was clear that they were hiding something, but what? Finally, Poirot turned his attention to the youngest member of the family, Verity Chatterton, Lady Chatterton's niece. She was sitting quietly in the corner, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief. Her pale face revealed little emotion, but Poirot could see the unease in her eyes. "Miss Chatterton," Poirot began, his voice steady but probing, "you seem particularly quiet today. Is there something you wish to tell me?" She looked up, startled by the directness of his question. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she spoke. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Monsieur Poirot. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. Her words were weighted with guilt that had only now come to the surface. He leaned in slightly, his gaze sharp. "What do you mean, Miss Chatterton? What are you trying to say?" I was the one who told Orville about the secret," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I was the one who started it all. I thought that if Orville knew he would help, but I didn't know it would lead to this. I didn't know he would die." Poirot took a step back, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to snap into place. Orville had been more than just a blackmailer. He had been a whistleblower, a man who knew too much, and now, it seemed, he had paid the ultimate price for his knowledge. Lady Chatterton, hearing her niece's words, looked stricken. "No, you couldn't have. You didn't." But Poirot raised his hand, silencing her. But you see, Lady Chatterton, the truth is out. The real question now is whether Miss Chatterton knew more than she's admitting." The final answer was now within reach. But the next moment would reveal everything. The game was coming to its conclusion, and Poirot was ready.